the neuroscience of language. So happy to have you come. Thanks.
Having me here. Good volume. Everybody can hear me? Okay. So I'm going to give you a perspective that's a little different from Shelley's perspective, but I think in some ways complementary, and if we all agreed on everything, it would be no fun. I'm going to focus on the neuroscience findings primarily, and then Anya Ivanova, who is going to talk right after lunch, is going to talk more about the implications of these and other findings for AI. So as humans, we possess a rich arsenal of cognitive skills. Across our life, we acquire a whole bunch of concepts, often referred to as the basic building blocks of cognition, which includes concrete concepts such as umbrella, but also abstract ones such as justice. And we learn how things work in the world, how these different concepts relate to one another. We learn about the physical constraints on the world, things like gravity. We learn about social agents, how to reason about the minds of others. We learn how to navigate our environments. We learn about numerosities. We heard about this from Fei Xu yesterday, and from Brendan Lake earlier. Reasoning can also be domain general, so kind of abstracted away from any knowledge bases. This kind of reasoning is often linked to the notion of fluid intelligence and associated with so-called executive abilities like attention, working memory, and cognitive control. We can remember the past and imagine the future. Using this information, we can plan and make decisions. We create and appreciate music and visual arts. In some cultures, people also develop formal reasoning skills, including mathematics and logic, invent complex strategy games such as chess, develop a deep scientific understanding of the world, and build and program machines. Many, though not all of these, are available at least in some form in non-human animals, including our close relatives, but also more phylogenetically distant species. The question that drew me to neuroscience was, what role does language play in human cognition? To what extent is our cognitive sophistication enabled to or unlocked by language? Some of the things we're able to do in some cultures, like building scientific theories of the world or creating a computer, certainly require language, perhaps in some trivial sense, because these things are only possible given the accumulation of knowledge that language enables. If every generation had to reinvent everything from scratch, we just wouldn't get very far. But I was interested in a much stronger claim, namely that we actually use linguistic representations such as words or linguistic syntactic structures to think. This question is especially salient for domains of cognition that are specific to humans, like mathematical and logical reasoning, but also applies to some other domains that exist in some form in other animals. For example, some have argued that although all animals involve in social reasoning, theory of mind in its full sophistication is only present in humans, or that certain forms of abstraction or the ability to project ourselves far into the future are especially well developed in humans. And of course, this question of the role of language in thinking has been at the heart of many debates across many fields: philosophy, linguistics, evolutionary biology, cognitive science, and more recently, AI. Many have expressed strong opinions about the importance of language in thought. So for example, Chomsky wrote, the systems of thought use linguistic expressions for reasoning, interpretation, organizing action, and other mental acts. And then in a later piece, a substantial part of what we call thinking is simply linguistic manipulation. So if there's a severe deficit of language, there will be a severe deficit of thought. He states these things as if they're facts, which philosophers sometimes do, but they're not. These are hypotheses, and I wanted to evaluate these ideas empirically. So as I mentioned, I turned to neuroscience, which provides the most direct way to investigate relationships among mental functions, to figure out which functions rely on the same machinery and which are distinct. So in a way to discover, if you wish, the natural kinds of the mind and brain, or the nearly decomposable systems in the terms of Herb Simon. So in the remainder of the talk, I'm going to introduce a system that supports language processing in our brain. Then I'm going to summarize work that suggests that language is not the medium of thought, and I'll also briefly tell you what we know about the dissociations that exist in the space of thinking and reasoning. And finally, I'll talk about how we have started using neural network language models as models of human language processing in the brain. Okay, So starting with the language system. Before I could ask my critical question, what role does language play in thinking, if any, I had to figure out how to reliably identify the system of interest in the brain so I could study it and be confident that I'm referring to the same bits across any given individuals, across studies, many, many studies that I was planning to do. So drawing inspiration from vision, which is a very successful and much more advanced field, I began by developing a so-called localizer paradigm that could be used to find language areas quickly and reliably using tools like functional MRI. I used a contrast between people listening to or reading sentences or short passages in a control condition that is perceptually similar but lacks linguistic meaning and structure. So things like reading a sequence of non-words or listening to speech in a language that's not familiar to you. And a few brain regions respond reliably to such contrasts. Here I'm showing you sample language systems in just 5 individuals. And as you can see, the general topography is similar, so everybody has some lateral frontal, some lateral temporal areas, but the precise location, shapes, and sizes of these regions vary quite a bit, just like our faces and fingerprints are unique. But importantly, just like our faces and fingerprints, the exact locations, this exact topography is highly stable within individuals over time. So here just maps from 2 sample participants across 3 time points each, and I hope again you can appreciate the similarity of the activation maps across the time points. So if I find your language areas today, they'll be in the same exact place 10 years later. So what have we learned about the system? So although our localizer paradigm, as I mentioned, is relying on comprehension, and I already alluded to the fact that it responds to both auditory and written language, related to the question that was asked during Shaylee's talk as well. And these regions also respond to sign languages and deaf individuals, but they also respond during production and across modality. So no matter if the ultimate output is spoken or written or typed or signed. Together, these 2 properties suggest that the system is most likely a place where we store our language knowledge, so our knowledge of what words mean and how we put them together. And of course, we need this knowledge to both encode a thought into a word sequence. This is the process of language production, what I'm doing right now, but also to decode others' meanings from word sequences that others may produce. So this is the process of language comprehension, what you guys are all doing now. This may give some of you pause, because if you've ever read anything about brain and language, you probably will have heard that we have separate areas for language production and comprehension, namely Broca's area and Wernicke's area, and you probably have seen pictures of some version of looking like this. And this is not wrong, but these areas, as they were originally discovered by Broca and Wernicke, they're not language areas, okay? They're speech areas. So at the level of speech perception and articulation, there is indeed a dissociation. So here's what these areas look like next to the language system, shown in purple. And so Wernicke's area, shown in light blue, primary auditory cortex is shown in darker blue right on top, processes auditory speech signals and extracts word sequences from speech acoustics, and it provides input to the language system during comprehension. Broca's area, the area in red, is a speech motor planning area, so it receives input from the language system during production to then plan a sequence of motor movements that will need to be executed by the motor cortex. And a key difference between these areas and the language system is that these areas are not sensitive to the meaningfulness of the signal that they perceive or produce. So for example, right now I'm talking, and your language areas, the purple areas, I assure you, are working in each of your brains. But so are speech perception areas, because of course you also need to process the sounds of the speech signal before you can interpret them. Now, if I suddenly switch to a language that you don't understand, say Tagalog, your speech perception area would work just as strongly, because it's still getting its preferred input, which is speech sounds, but the activity in your language areas would plummet because you can no longer extract any meaningful information. You cannot recognize words or how they go together. And similarly, I can engage your Broca's area, the articulatory area, if I just ask you to say a simple sequence of syllables like ba, da, and the language regions respond only a little bit during such conditions. To engage the language regions fully, I need to engage you in something more complex, like producing sentence-level strings. Okay. Developmentally, the language system cannot be there at birth functionally, because we don't come into the world being able to understand and produce language. But by about 3 years of age, the system looks in topography adult-like. It's probably there earlier because behaviorally, by about 1.5, 2 years of age, kids are already pretty sophisticated communicators, linguistic communicators, but it's very hard to measure brain responses below 3 or 4 age period, although I have a postdoc who is trying to do exactly that right now. This language system is similar in its topography and various properties across typologically diverse languages. So this is a lot of this work was done by Saima Malik Moraleda. And here just some sample maps from native speakers of 4 languages. We have now established a similarity across about 50 different languages, including quite unusual languages like the Piraha, for example. And here are maps from 4 multilingual individuals to show you that different languages within a speaker recruit the same system. So how many people here are multilingual, bilingual or multilingual? Okay. Oh, usually a fair chunk in academia, and so for those of you who have multiple systems of 4 meaning mappings living in your brains, they all live in that same system. So for each individual, I'm showing you responses to one of their languages, and you can also maybe notice that the language doesn't need to be a natural language, so languages like Esperanto or Klingon that were invented by a single individual will engage the very same areas. Finally, damage to these regions in adulthood leads to linguistic deficits. So these regions are critical for language function once you've acquired your language knowledge. So I told you that the language system can be thought of as an encoder-decoder system, but what does it actually do? What computations does it support? So let's just very quickly unpack what we're doing when we are, say, understanding a sentence. If you're hearing a sentence, just a random sentence I made up or took from a corpus, I can't remember. A red-haired woman is playing with her dog. There are a few things that you must do to understand what the sentence means. You have to retrieve meanings of words, like what woman means, what red-haired means, dog, and so on. I'm showing it with pictures, but of course the meanings are likely more abstract. You have to use your knowledge of the grammar to determine how words go together to make a complex meaning, so you need to know that red-haired is a modifier of woman, and so on. Once you put these 2 pieces together, you can have some representation of the sentence-level meaning. And a number of paradigms have been developed in neuroscience to test for the engagement in these various component processes of language comprehension. And based on a large body of work that I won't have time to talk about in more detail today, we know that the language system supports computations that allow us to do basically all of these things: retrieve words from memory, put them together into complex syntactic structures, and construct complex meaning representations. Moreover, there is evidence that all of these computations happen across this entire system, such that in every region you can find sensitivity to all of these computations. So in other words, it's not the case, as some older proposals have argued, that you have some region that deals with word meanings and some other region that deals with building syntactic structures. Like that you just don't find that empirically. As Shaylee talked about earlier, her work and a few other groups have now found functional heterogeneity within the system, so it's not like a monolithic thing. But to the extent that you find differences, they seem to be present in neural populations that are kind of in the salt and pepper fashion. So that's why you don't find these regional level distinctions, like this frontal region does X and this region does Y. But there is heterogeneity, and heterogeneity spans things like sensitivity to particular meanings, how much temporal context you integrate, and how strongly you're modulated by the difficulty of linguistic processing. How these different dimensions relate to one another and how they combine to create the efficient and robust processing mechanism we have, I think, remains to be discovered. One thing I wanted to highlight a little bit in contrast to Shaylee's talk is that although it is indeed true that in a lot of the brain you can find some degree of semantic tuning, many populations, in fact, I would argue the majority of the neural populations that comprise a language system are actually relatively insensitive to content. And just to show you an example of this is work from Greta Tuchkuta. This is just a sample voxel's response to 1,000 sentences. If we just zoom into a few top responders, there is nothing really semantically coherent about the sentences that elicit a very high response. But however, there is another feature that predicts very well which sentences elicit the highest response, and that is processing difficulty, something that you can measure behaviorally, but also estimate, for example, by how surprising a string of words is using surprisal from language models. And you find similar semantic breadth at the voxel level using single word stimuli. So this is also work by Greta and former postdoc Maria Riskina, where if you look at responses to single words, you also find quite a lot of voxels whose highest responding stimuli are quite semantically diverse. If you think about it kind of for a few minutes, you may understand why you may need this content insensitivity. And this is because we can understand any arbitrary sentence, right? I can tell you a sentence that doesn't make sense, and your language system will be able to do its job just like any familiar sentence. So having some robustness to what exactly the content is actually a very sensible feature. Okay, so this was like a whirlwind of 15 years of work, which is also summarized in this review paper if you wanted a slower paced version, written with Anya Ivanova and postdoc in the lab, Tamar Regev. Okay, now onto the language-thought relationship. So how do we test this hypothesis that language is critical for thinking using tools in neuroscience? There are basically two primary methods for asking whether two mental functions rely on the same resources. One is a very old method, traditional neuropsychological approach, where you basically look for patterns of associations and dissociations in cases of brain damage, or using lesion approaches in animals. And the other is a more modern approach, which is brain imaging, where you find tasks that target two functions, and then you ask, do the same bits of the brain respond when you engage in those tasks? So I'm going to start with fMRI evidence, and as I just told you, we have this set of brain areas that are strongly and ubiquitously engaged when we process language. So we can now examine activity in these areas when participants do thinking, right? And you can tap thinking in many different ways. And we can ask, do we engage these language processing mechanisms when participants are reasoning in various ways, when they're solving math problems or doing a Rubik's Cube or whatever? And so here is a summary of a whole bunch of studies we've done over the years. They're all structured in exactly the same way. You find language areas in any given participant, and then you have them do some other task. And then you ask, okay, how do these regions respond when you're doing a math problem or listening to a piece of music or reason about what somebody else may be thinking or believing? In gray are responses to three language conditions. So there's sentence listening, sentence reading, and sentence production, in this case describing pictures of common events. The magnitudes are always estimated in data that are independent from the data that are used to find these regions, so there's no circularity. And in different colors are responses to a whole slew of non-linguistic conditions spanning different domains and paradigms. And as you can see, these language areas respond at least 2 times more strongly during language tasks compared to any non-linguistic condition that we've tested so far. This is a very strong degree of selectivity. So for those of you who may be familiar with the vision literature, we have this region that has been very well characterized in humans and macaques. Well, in macaques it takes a form of face patches, but we have a region called the fusiform face area, which responds 2 or 3 times more strongly to faces than to any other visual stimuli. This is a comparable degree of selectivity you find in language relative to non-linguistic conditions. And I should mention that all of these non-linguistic conditions elicit a very strong response somewhere else in the brain. It's just in a different part that's non-overlapping with these language areas. Another thing is that here I'm averaging responses across each of those 5 language areas, but they're the same in each one of them individually. So it's not like one language region is less selective than others. Yeah?
How sensitive are these experiments? If you wanted to explore a hypothesis that language gets in the way of thought, would you be able to explore that?
Gets in the way of thought, meaning like it's harder for you to think?
That people who think very clearly maybe suppress language. Say you started with that hypothesis, could you test it?
Yeah, so there's actually behavioral ways to test this kind of an idea, and some people have tried to do this in some domains. So there's these paradigms that people have used actually since the 60s and 70s called verbal interference paradigms. So sometimes you're asked to do what's called verbal shadowing. So you'll have earphones, and you will be played some auditory speech stimulus, and your task is to repeat it as quickly, with as little delay as possible, right? And then while you're doing this, you're asked to do some other thing. And you can see to what degree does this kind of interference affect your ability to do some, say, spatial reasoning tasks.
I had in mind a more subtle question, which is not whether external language interferes with your thought, but whether internal language interferes.
That's harder. Anya Ivanova is actually just launching this big research program on studying inner speech, which is, I think, like when you're kind of talking to yourself and how that may or may not. And she's trying to figure out ways to robustly and reliably measure this in individual. And Gary Lupian, somewhere there. Gary's done a lot of beautiful work trying to understand what this phenomenology is. It's a super interesting phenomenon, but very hard to study objectively, but these guys will figure it out, I'm confident. Okay, but importantly, you see that there's not much response to these various kinds of thinking tasks, and since this graph has been made, which just took a lot of time to make, Hope Keen, who is a PhD student in the lab, has extended this to other domains like physical reasoning about like whether a cup will, topple over if I put it on the edge, as well as logical tests, so deductive and inductive reasoning also don't engage these areas. So a complementary approach for probing the relationship between language and other functions is to examine cognitive abilities in individuals who don't have a properly functioning language system due to something like aphasia. And most informative in this space are cases of so-called global aphasia, which results from really severe extensive damage to the whole so-called perisylvian cortex. So there's this thing, sylvian fissure, that separates your frontal from temporal lobe. And the middle cerebral artery, which you can feel your heart beating in if you just put your finger on your neck, it supplies this lateral side of the brain. And sometimes if you have a really large stroke, you can wipe out this whole chunk of the side of the brain. And that leads to really severe problems. So people can't understand or produce language. At best, they will recognize some very high-frequency common words. But it's really very, very profound linguistic deficits. And we can take these individuals and we can ask, what can they still do? Can they still solve a math problem? Can they do a Sudoku puzzle or play a round of chess? Can they write music if they were writing music before, right? And in this way, we can try to test whether the language representations are critically needed to engage in these various tasks, right? And it turns out that in spite of their severe linguistic deficits, these individuals appear to be able to think just fine. And their intelligence appears to be intact. So the only thing they seem to lack is the ability to convert their thoughts into a verbal format and to extract meaningful information from others' linguistic productions. A lot of this work has been done by Rosemary Varley at UCL in collaboration with Anya Ivanova and Hope, who I already mentioned.
How can reasoning in someone can read and speak?
You can use visual information to convey things. I mean, in general, it's quite an intense enterprise testing cognitive abilities in these populations, right? Because you can't explain instructions to them, which a lot of high-level cognitive tasks require. But there is a whole range of methods that people have developed in working with animals or with preverbal infants, where you can find creative ways to get what's needed across. But yeah, Rosemary Varley is a really fantastic experimentalist who's figured out a lot of cool ways to tap into their cognition. So empirically, it turns out that language and thought draw on distinct resources in the brain, and even in the presence of severe language deficits, thinking and reasoning can remain intact. In other words, language and thought appear to be distinct in the mind and brain. We recently put out, we recently put out a review where we argued that the primary function of language is not to help us think, but to enable communication. A shocker, I know. But in addition to the evidence I've already mentioned here, we talk about a large independent body of evidence showing that different features of natural languages across typologically diverse languages appear to be optimized for transferring information efficiently in noisy environments. So the sound systems of languages, how the conceptual space is divided up into lexica, how words are combined together. Kyle Maholt, somewhere here, has done a lot of this work. Yeah, and then just to clarify, it is, of course, the case that we can use language in the service of thinking, just like we can use drawings and schematics and all sorts of other visual tools to maybe offload some information from our working memory to be able to keep of more things, to linearize certain arguments, right? You all may have had this impression where you think you really understand something, but then you kind of write down, so I sit down to write a paper and you're like, wait a second, these pieces don't quite go together, right? So there is a way in which we can use language as a tool, but the representations that you use to reason are not linguistic in nature. Yes?
So what you're showing is that language and thought, once they're developed, or like these kinds of thoughts, once they're developed, they are completely distinct. That I can agree with, but one question, or to play devil's advocate, what if language is required to develop these thoughts?
Yes, it's a great question. Lots of people have wondered about this. Vygotsky has a great, Russian psychologist has a great story about this. So it's very hard to evaluate these ideas empirically because we can't deprive kids of language, but there is a little bit of data, mostly coming from kids who are deaf and born to hearing parents. So in such cases, their parents will not typically know a sign language, and they cannot hear a speech. So unless somebody is signing to them, they sometimes spend the first, into their teenage years without linguistic input. Okay? They develop a communication system called home sign, which is a way to, get some things across. But it's far from a full-fledged language. And so you can ask, how do cognitive abilities in these kids develop? And it's a devastating thing to be deprived of linguistic input, and there's all sorts of issues that these kids, difficulties that these kids exhibit. But aside from one domain, which is theory of mind, it doesn't seem like these kids can't think causally about the world, that they can't make abstractions from the kinds of things they learn. So it doesn't seem like there's like a fundamental transform, but there are definitely effects. It's much easier to learn about the world through language.
So perhaps what he's saying is that for some types of thinking, language is necessary, but it doesn't mean that oral or
what are they?
Thinking language is necessary. I think.
What are those types of thinking? Give me something to test, okay? I mean, look, I'm like very, very favorable to trying to say, okay, is there some version of that claim that could, be true in some sense? So then my task to people who raise these questions is, please give me a paradigm where you think language is necessary, and we will test it. So far, we've been testing everything that has been proposed explicitly enough to turn it into an experimental paradigm, and we find a consistent answer that those things don't engage it. I'm not saying it's impossible to come up with such a thing, but so far. Writing a novel?
This thinking there? I mean, how can you,
writing a novel involves a language production process. So unless you're tapping into something like, conceptualizing an idea, but then again, you need to figure out which stage of that do you mean? Of course, once you're writing, of course you're going to engage your language system.
But I mean, I didn't see them as being separate. I think their language is sort of intricately linked in the kinds of expressions you're making.
Absolutely, because a species develops a communication system that is going to help them to transfer the internal contents of their mind to other conspecifics. So there has to be some degree of isomorphism between the communicative signals that exist and the mental states that we want to express using those signals. That is absolutely true. But the question I've set out to answer in the last bunch of years is whether the nature of the representations that you recruit when you engage in these different kinds of reasoning, whether they use the same kinds of representations that we use to produce and understand language. And so far the answer seems to be no. Yeah?
I'm wondering, out of the tasks that you're testing, do you know how many of them are not possible for other primates? Like, are there? Do you have some tasks that have been tested with other primates and?
Yeah. For almost every, and there's a really nice review paper by Jessica Cantlin and Steve Piantadosi on this. for almost any test that has been argued to be like not possible to do by non-human animals, there's some version of that test that they can do. So it's not like they're fundamentally unable to think abstractly or to imagine what another conspecific. They're just not doing it quite as well. But there's certainly tasks which vary across human cultures, and right. So formal math, words for exact numbers, and ability to manipulate those is not culturally universal. So we've tested those kinds of things. Formal logic also not present, at least some parts of that are not present universally. And yeah, those seem to pattern with other kinds of things. Yeah, maybe one more question, or yeah, okay, go ahead.
Is it like kind of similar to a situation where a blind person from birth, they still have some abstraction of shapes, but even though they don't have
Sorry, I missed the very first part of your sentence.
If someone is blind from birth,
Yeah.
I think we know they still have abstraction of shapes, like circles and other things, when they think about it, even though they haven't seen it. Is it
Well, they also have language. Blind people have perfect.
But how so when they haven't seen a circle, right, that
Yeah.
they have seen, when they think of a circle, they're thinking in a similar way to what I would think of.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
So it seems to go beyond language or visual things, something more intricate in the brain itself. Is it kind of related to the fact that some parts of thought is not connected to language?
I'm not sure. I think the evidence from the blind tells you that you can learn a lot about meaning from language alone, right? So because distributional patterns support, like they reflect the structure of the world, so presumably from that information, somebody who does not see color can develop a similar representation of the color space, or somebody who does not see shapes can figure out what must mean by circle and no longer. It's not perfect, so Marina Bedny's work has explored questions in that space in rich detail, and there's some kinds of information that are actually not preserved if you don't have access to perceptual information, but a lot of it presumably you learn through language in such cases.
I could ask you later. You should probably.
Okay, yeah. So let me just, okay, so I've told you that language is dissociable from thinking and reasoning, but I haven't said much about the structure of human thought. And just like we can use neuroscience to understand the relationship between language and thought, we can ask what kinds of thinking are dissociable, or is it just one big undifferentiated mess? It's a big open research program. A lot of things I think remain to be discovered, but there's a few systems that have been shown to. So here I've conceptually separated things for you, right? I can say, okay, conceptually we can kind of think of numerical stuff as maybe separate from strategy games like chess. But do we have evidence that some of these are empirically dissociable in the mind and brain? And I'll mention just a few systems for you briefly. So the first system is a system that's often referred to as the multiple demand system. Others refer to it as the executive function or cognitive control system. So this system is engaged by diverse executive function demands. Whenever you're focusing on a task, this system is helping you do that. Individual differences in the activity of this network have been linked to fluid intelligence differences, and damage to the system, and sadly, its decay during healthy aging is associated with a loss of fluid intelligence, which declines steadily from about 25 years onward. Numerical cognition, I mentioned so. So numerical cognition ends up loading on the system, and so does mathematical and logical reasoning. And as Anya Ivanova showed, understanding bits of computer code are also recruiting the system. This is a very sharply distinct system, which also supports high-level cognition, is a theory of mind or social reasoning system, which are brain regions that are engaged when you're thinking about what somebody else believes or thinks or feels. Okay, so this is kind of a mentalizing system. And the last system I'll mention is the so-called default network, which is most strongly associated with so-called episodic projection. So remembering yourself in the past or projecting yourself into the future. For a long time, it was conflated with the theory of mind network because the brain regions are kind of in roughly similar places, but it's now well established that they're distinct. And one important property of this network is that it integrates information over extended contexts of time. As Shaylee was talking about in her work, some of these areas that she was pointing that are anatomically consistently tracking these long contexts are members of this network. And some people have linked that system to spatial navigation, perhaps because there is always a spatial component to how we put ourselves into some kind of temporal context. And of course, that's not it. Some other systems are being discovered, like just in the last few years. There is a system that appears to support intuitive physical reasoning, a system that supports a region that appears to support causal reasoning specifically, and Hope Keen is finding some regions that seem to be specifically strongly engaged in deduction compared to induction. So given this recent work, I think there's more components that are yet to be discovered. And as I told you, all of these systems are distinct from the kind of core language system. And remember how I said that the key difference between the speech perception and speech articulation areas and the language areas is that those regions are not sensitive to the meaningfulness of the signal, whereas the language system is deeply sensitive to how meaningful the signal is. So the key difference between the language system and all of these thinking systems is that you can engage any of these thinking systems by language. That's the power of language, right? I can give you a math problem to solve. I can tell you something about what I'm thinking or feeling and engage your theory of mind network. I can tell you some deeply emotional content and engage your amygdala or some circuits that process emotional information. But in sharp contrast to the language areas, the areas that support cognition that I've talked about as separate from language, they will respond to other kinds of input that elicit similar mental representations. So you can make an inference about somebody changing their mind when you just see somebody walking and then turning and starting to walk backward, right? You can watch a silent film and make all sorts of rich inferences about the context and the unfolding narrative. And again, of course, visual stimuli can elicit strong emotions and so on. Okay, so in the remaining time I have, I'm going to talk about, in the context of this separation, and like I said, Anya is going to talk more about the implications of that separation for AI. So I want to talk about how we've been really excited about language models as potential models of this core language processing systems. Because after all, these systems are the first organism we have, other than humans, that are really, really good at language. And that's really exciting. I really don't understand how some people are not excited by this, if they're a language researcher especially. Like, I just find this mind-boggling. Because I've been jealous for years of my vision colleagues who can take circuits apart in animals in ways that we couldn't dream to do in humans. So now we have something. It's an in silico organism. It's not a biological one. But to the extent that there's some similarity in behavior, and as I'll show you, as Shaylee already showed you, that there's similarity in representations, why not try to leverage this as an additional very powerful tool to understand how language may work in humans? So the approach, so this is inspired by Shaylee's early work, the approach that you can use to ask whether the representations are similar. I'll just walk through it a little bit slower because it was a lot of information in Shaylee's talk. So the approach is very simple. These encoding models, the logic in itself is pretty simple, and it's very similar to what people do when they say relate representations from convolutional neural networks to macaque responses to visual stimuli, for those of you who may be familiar with this. So you basically take the same stimulus, so in this case it's a sentence, and you feed it to a model, and you feed it to the human brain. From the model, you can extract unit activation weights. From the brain, you can extract some responses, whatever recording modality you're using. In our case, the interest is in this language system, so we record responses within that system. And then we have basically two sets of numbers, and then we try to just use some similarity metric to relate them, right? And a standard approach is a linear regression, where you just try to predict one set of numbers from another set of numbers, and you do it using some set of stimuli, right? And then you see how well it generalizes to left out ones. You can also use approaches like representational similarity analysis to say, okay, the sentences that are treated as similar in the pattern of responses in the brain, how does it relate to how similar they are in the network patterns of activity? And so back a few years ago, Martin Schrimp, who is now faculty at EPFL in Switzerland, decided to compare a whole bunch of different models, again, building on the approaches that have been used in vision, to see how well you can predict responses in the language areas from model activations. And we took some existing data sets that we had and tested 43 models. So each model here is a bar. And on the y-axis, it's basically similarity to the brain in this measure that I mentioned. And so here is what we find. So the gray line here is the upper bound or the ceiling, how well you can predict brain responses in brain responses in an individual from brain responses in another individual, which is about how high you can expect an external different model to do. And you can see that these models vary quite a lot. So all of the models that use contextual representations do much better than like GloVe and Word2Vec, which are these early distributional models. And the best performing models are GPT-2, like unidirectional attention transformers. Because they hit the ceiling doesn't tell you that we've solved language, right? It tells you that our ceiling probably is not estimated quite right, and we're working, it's really non-trivial to do this in language neuroscience. But also, the measurements are extremely coarse. So this is from an fMRI data set. We're lacking all sorts of temporal dynamics. But the good thing is that there is some signal there, okay? It's a non-trivial amount of signal. And these results now, so Shaili was the first to build an encoding model back in 2018. And in the last few years, there's like a proliferation of research in the space showing that this result generalizes across data sets, across recording modalities, across the kinds of models you use, and so on. Yeah?
Just a quick question about these results. So which internal representations are being mapped to brain neural states? Like, because it's like layer by layer.
That's right.
You get different.
So what you typically do is you use some of the data to see which layer does best, and then you lock that, and you use that in the validation.
Do we have an insight? Is it like higher layers?
It's middle to late layers. In different models, it's a little bit.
Final layers. It's never the final.
No.
Okay.
And just one quick thing. Like one thing I find remarkable, and there's now a whole effort to try to use insights from neuroscience or even neuroscience data directly to make these models more aligned to the brain. But I think actually the coolest thing is that these models weren't built as models of human language processing. They were built by engineers to do NLP tests, to do machine translation. And in spite of the fact that there's a completely separate goal from language researchers who are trying their hardest to understand how language works, you end up with representational spaces that are really quite aligned. So suggesting that something about the statistics of the input that you have to process and represent to do these kinds of things is really powerful and is shaping the representations to be a certain way. Your question? Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Me?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the same question I asked before. Do you think having alignment in terms of like intermediate representations between two systems is telling us anything about the
computations? No, of course not.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
no, it's just not there yet.
It's still possible that GPT and the brain at
do
the
it completely differently. Very possible.
Manipulate this internal representation through completely different operations.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah, and I mean that's an open question, and a lot of people are trying to get at that and trying, So I have a postdoc, Eqbal Hosseini, who is trying to figure out the algorithms models might be using to predict, for example, in terms of the straightening of a sentence representation as it's passed through the layers. Okay, and then try to link it to neural data and see if we can get some handle on this. But it's hard. Those things are hard. Yep.
I think you and some of the previous presenters have alluded to this, but generally, do models align better with the brain to perform better on like standard NLP and reasoning tasks?
Yeah. So thank you for that question. So indeed, no, it's great. So once you have a bunch of different models and some are better than others, you can start asking what are the features of a model that it needs to have a good alignment to the brain. Is it something about its architecture? Is it something about how it does language to the extent that we can use some like circuit analysis to get it to those operations? Is it something about just the size of the model? I mean, that would be boring and not very insightful, but so these kinds of things. And so we find in this set of models, we find that similar to what has been found in vision, where models that do best on object recognition also provide a better fit to the brain, models that do best on this predictive objective of how well you can predict an upcoming word tend to lead to a better match to the brain. This is not always the case, as I'll tell you in just like 2 slides. Let's see how much time do I have. A little bit. It's okay if I just keep going because I have just like a little bit of stuff to wrap up. So just a couple of brief things of how we've been building on this in various ways. So this is work by Greta Tuchkuta. So she wanted to kind of go beyond seeing this similarity in the representation, say, are they similar enough so that you can kind of control the activity in the language system, move it up and down. What the hell do I mean by this? Here's what I mean by this. Okay, so this is now one model, and the individual dots are sentences. So she collected responses to 1,000 sentences, which is a fair number, in, say, 5 participants. Okay, so each of them, in this case, read 1,000 sentences. And then you fit a regression from, in this case, GPT-2XL representations to human responses. This is just a univariate, simple measure, average across the whole language system. This is very coarse. Okay, so it's just how much your language system goes up and down for a sentence. Okay, and this is just replicating the things I already mentioned. So there is some relationship there. And then she said, okay, now we have massive corpora of language. So let's try to extend this regression line and try to see if we can find stimuli that this mapping model between activity in models and brains would elicit a really high response in the language regions, and which stimuli would elicit a really low response in the language regions. Okay, and so she goes to a massive corpus and finds these sentences, and then brings in completely new participants, presents those drive and suppress sentences to those participants, and sees if you can modulate. For those of you who, by the way, know animal ethology literature, this is like finding a supernormal stimulus. Well, for the drive part, right? Like finding that red spot on the seagull that will elicit, a pecking response in a baby seagull. Anyway, so this works. I wouldn't be telling you otherwise, right? So the drive sentences elicit a very high response. Suppress, this is relative to this 1,000 base sentences. And that's cool, but then, of course, we can also try to understand what is it that the system likes the most, what are the features. And in a nutshell, it's basically linguistic input that obeys language statistics enough to be recognized as an in-domain stimulus, but that's hard to process. Okay, so it's kind of like this nonlinear relationship. So if you just get you like a bunch of unrelated words, the responses are low, then it gets higher, higher, higher. Then you get into the domain of language, and there, harder sentences or harder parts of the sentences we've shown with like time-resolved methods elicit a higher response. Andrea de Varda he's long been interested in multilingual models, and so he was interested to see whether there is enough similarity that is captured in multilingual models across languages, so you can zero-shot predict activity in a language that a mapping model has not been exposed to. Did not think this would work at all. He did, good for him. And so we took data from 12 diverse languages, and we basically took a whole bunch of multilingual language models. Some have the explicit mapping between languages, like machine translation models. Some are just implicit, have representations that may implicitly align. And then he would train a mapping model on, say, whatever, Spanish, Tamil, Lithuanian, and then check if you can predict brain responses in Afrikaans, and this works, which is remarkable. And in this case, we looked again at what features of models make them better do the zero-shot transfer to new languages. And here, it's not how well you can do the next word prediction. It's how well the internal representations are aligned across languages, right? How similar are the parts of the space to which similar meaning sentences are mapped. So that's super exciting. Some of the stuff that's been done in this space was reviewed by Greta Tuchkuta in this review paper recently. And in just 2 minutes, if I may, I'll just say very briefly which things I find most exciting in this space. So this question I already mentioned, right? We started asking this question a little bit, but so far just with off-the-shelf models, which vary in all sorts of ways. So you want to do careful minimal pair comparisons, like varying, minimal features of model architecture, of their training data, of their training objectives, including maybe building, I'm just skipping some things, biologically more plausible models, whatever that may mean for you. There's a whole bunch of things in which, ways in which you can make these models more likely. You can look at what linguistic features are shared between LLMs and human representations. So Iqbal Husseini, who I already mentioned, he was kind of impressed but not satisfied by the fact that many different kinds of models do pretty good at predicting human brain responses to language. What does that mean? So he wanted to stress test these models, and he said, okay, let's find sentences that are represented as differently as possible between pairs of these high-performing models to kind of try to push the representations as far apart as possible to see whether suddenly one model will come out as a winner, right? Like this one aligns with just the right features and how humans represented and other models. Well, didn't work out this way. Turns out that all high-performing models are converging on the same representational space. This is this notion of universal representations that has also been emerging in some other fields. And basically by pushing models, by taking stimuli that push models apart in the representational space, you're pushing them also away from the brain. So those sentences that are represented differently across models, no single model can predict brain responses to. Okay, the models just could basically fail. And then he did other experiments showing that by manipulating the similarity of intermodal representations, you can see how well, you can manipulate how well models predict brain activity. And then just pointing to ongoing directions, we're trying to also use these models to understand language development, much in the ways like Mike was talking about, and some of Brendan's work is relevant to as well. We're trying to do this using neural responses in human babies to test various ideas about how language representations change as a function of experience, as well as simulate potentially language disorders in some of these models. So I'm going to stop here. So the two things I want you to take away from all of this very fast speech that you've been listening to is that language and thought appear to be separable in the human brain. Language relies on a specialized set of brain areas. Different aspects of thought also dissociate from each other, but there's more to be done there. And there's something similar about the representations from neural networks, neural network language models to human brain responses, which I think just opens the door to really exciting questions that we couldn't dream of asking before. Okay, thank you so much.
That was a beautiful talk, lots of really cool work. So I had a question about final result from Eckert. And it's very interesting what you said about how there are some sentences that drive these models into very different subspaces, and that affects the predicting responses.
Yeah.
So is it that none of these models are predicting the responses well, or is it that they're explaining different parts of the evidence?
None of them are predicting responses well. So predictivity drops precipitously, which we spent like half a year ensuring that we didn't make some mistake, because it's the lowest predictivity I've ever seen, but we've now seen it across a couple data sets. It seems something is, and we see it in vision too. So using an existing vision data set, you also get a reduction in predictivity for images that are represented.
It's not that they're explaining different parts of the signal.
No, he was also initially thinking very much along those lines, and it doesn't look like. Brendan.
Great talk. It looks like you did a lot of comparisons with like the GPT-2 family, and of course that's years in the past at this point in terms of the power of large language models. So I'm wondering how like the recent generation does, and actually if you make a prediction that as these models like start to do a lot more than language now, are they actually going to be like potentially less relevant to understand?
That's a very good question. So I mean, there's many points there, but so for example, for behavioral, for reading time data, in fact, some of the larger models do worse than slightly smaller models. But a lot of these larger models are trained on a lot more than language, right? And so to the extent that you're interested in understanding the language system, you may not want models that are also trained on like, math textbooks or computer code or something like that. There's a lot of interesting other questions you can ask with those models. Like, for example, if you have a model that does good on language and decently on math, maybe with up to like 3-digit additions or something like that, you can say, okay, are there parts of model representations that predict differentially well responses to language versus to people solving math problems? And Ben Lipkin in my group is kind of trying to do that kind of thing and comparing it to neurosymbolic approaches where you take a language, like a smallish language model, and hook it up to like a calculator effectively, but something like that. So yeah, I mean, I think at this point there's also a dearth of high quality data of the right kind. So people have been collecting data for a long time in language, but what you want is specific and reliable responses to particular language stimuli. And I like the naturalistic approaches, which is what a lot of Shaylee's and Alex Hoos's data has been, and work in Uri Hassan's group as well. But I think there's limitations to fully naturalistic language data because language is really annoying. A lot of stuff gets confounded. So in many cases, particular kinds of meanings are confounded with particular kinds of formal properties that appear in those contexts, like the form of words or the frequency of words or the concreteness of words, which is a little bit related to meaning, but not quite to particular kinds of concepts. And so I think using some combination of large naturalistic data, which are easier to collect in a sense because you can get people to watch movies for hours in the scanner. People will do this compared to, reading 10,000 sentences, which is what we're trying to do. Currently, Greta Tichkuta is starting this effort. But I think there's a lot of importance to using stimuli that can help you tease apart features that are naturally confounded in language.
So obviously, like you were saying, a lot of the largest models are really encoding a lot of not strictly linguistic or not like broad distribution content. And so like for cases where the model is trained on a lot of code or where there's instruction tuning or post-training feedback, etc. Have you looked at whether the representations get closer to any of the non-linguistic reasoning faculties in humans, or like, do you think that that's possible?
Those data definitely don't exist. I think it should be possible. Like nobody has responses in the brain to like a particular math problem or a particular logic problem. We're starting to collect some of these data in some efforts, but there's just no data to test these ideas right now. But I think it's definitely a cool direction. Gary.
Yeah, thank you. So looking at this slide, I agree with these 2 points. And yet, as you know, for the last 20 years, we've been doing work showing that language is involved in all kinds of human cognition, that verbal interference affects putatively non-linguistic tasks, that aphasia, it's interesting, it's possible to find cases of aphasic individuals who do okay on tasks on a group level. There is lots of 50, 60 years of work showing these group level effects, and yet there is variability. So it sort of shows that there is involvement, but there are other ways perhaps of succeeding on the tasks. And so it occurs to me that one perhaps reason that other people are reaching different conclusions, despite we're using different methods, but there is some convergence, is that another way of looking at it is not is a language network activated in some task, right? But rather, what kind of effects does language, both prior experience with language and online recruitment of language, right, have on a given task? So, as one example, we have work showing that hearing a color word affects people's real-time color processing. And you can show that these effects are early. There's modulation of low visual cortex. I don't know. You can see it in EEG. It might be hard to see it in fMRI. But so does it mean that it's impossible to perceive color categorically without language? Well, no. Does it mean that other animals don't perceive colors categorically? Well, the evidence for that is sort of yes and no. But it does show that language in real time is modulating, in some cases, very low-level perceptual processing.
It can. I think, thank you for this question. I think just first to comment on this point that a lot of people have indeed reported there is an association between having a linguistic deficit and a non-linguistic deficit in aphasia. But this has to be the case because the language areas are right next door to all sorts of thinking areas. So if you have a stroke, which doesn't care about functional boundaries, which affects a bunch of nearby areas, those have to go together. So that result, I just don't think tells us that much because most of these individuals are not scanned functionally pre-stroke, right? And so I wouldn't make too much of that result. And in fact, I think that's a case where having single case studies of somebody who doesn't have any language but can do all these things are really, really informative. But like I alluded to when I mentioned the Nature position paper, I'm not denying that language can be used as a useful tool, just like drawing can be. Like when I write papers, I draw schematics of my arguments. It's very useful to me. Like I can't hold this all in my head. So there's some, and maybe some of these effects happen online. I'm not convinced by some of the results of effects online. I think but to the extent that they happen, they're very, very small and subtle. So I'm not here to say, okay, there is like no way in which language can affect things. But personally, when I started out, I was confident that language is the medium of thought, and I was fully expecting to find that language and math would overlap and that language and logic would overlap, and I was proven wrong, and that's okay, because that's how science works. So, yeah.
Yeah, so you showed that, like, in one of the early experiments, that like language doesn't line up for all these, or doesn't light up for all these other tasks. I was wondering if you found like other regions that light up for tasks that intuitively might not feel connected, or like, is it always like, did you find just a one-on-one mapping, or do you find some surprising mappings?
Oh, there's a lot. I mean, so one I think that's very surprising to me is that nobody has convincingly shown selectivity for mathematical cognition. That kind of process seems to load on the same system that you can engage by a simple or complex working memory task, which has nothing to do with the domain of math. We acquire a huge, especially living in industrialized societies, we acquire a huge amount of math knowledge. So somehow that has to be stored, and it appears to just load on this very general system. One interesting possibility is that culturally late inventions co-opt this very general kind of, GPU-like system, which basically is there by evolution to help you deal with new stuff, right? Because if you have everything specialized for a particular function, you would be kind of screwed if you come up with some new things, and environment changes all the time. So maybe it's good to have some general resources that are resistant to specialization. And in fact, Robert Yang showed that in recurrent neural nets, if you train a model on a whole bunch of different things, you see specialization. But if you keep introducing new tasks, there's a subset of the network that becomes resilient to specialization, because the network learns that you might leave some units to learn new things because they keep coming up, and you don't want to fully assign units to particular tasks. So, yeah.
Great talk. I also want to focus on the first claim that you've made. In particular, you're going back to math or something much simpler, which is necessary for the exact numbers. So I'm thinking about this much older paper from Stanley Hunn's group some years ago to show there's a differentiation between approximate number sense sort of tasks and then exact number computation, and this the latter, the language network. I think that's their claim.
Yeah, that's a 99 Science paper. He's backed off of those claims.
On top of that, there's a lot of developmental data that suggests that as children acquire, simplest math concept possible, the meanings of 3, 4, 5, 6 or something, language seems to play a pretty critical role. So I'm wondering how that sort of...
Yeah, so the neural data are a false positive. So Stan has backed off of those data, and ever since our 2011 paper got published and Martin Monti's paper got published in Psych Science, showing very clear separation between language and exact math. He's had a couple of studies from his group showing that language and math do not overlap. The developmental data you refer to, I assume you're talking about Liz Spelke's work with Zifkin. Is that the kind of data you're talking about?
That's one line of work where there's verbal interference in exact math in Russian, I believe, in your native language, actually.
Yeah.
And then I'm also thinking about just in general, people like Dave Barner and others have shown that the linguistic input you get, because number systems actually vary across languages, right? Definitely has an impact on how quickly you can figure out the meanings of number words, which goes along with this idea that maybe later on you get this kind of verbal interference, right? So I'm thinking about whether the concepts are developed because of the language you have, because the nonverbal system, as we know, is very different from ultimately what you get, right?
I think it's very...
Some tension.
Yeah. I mean, so we've done some work on this with Peter Hine, and Ted Gibson has followed up on this with Ben Pitt and Steve here. So I think it's a very interesting idea that having a word helps you develop a concept. Like in general, the way I think about it is if you have a mental state that you'd like to express, you as a group of communicating entities will come up with a word to refer to it or something like that. The exact dynamics of the development of number concepts, I'm going to leave to Steve to talk more about if he'd like. But the effects of the bilingual interference things, I think those are really, really interesting effects, but I don't think they tell you about the effects of language and thought. I think they fall in this very interesting space of specificity with the particular operations you engage in. So an example that I've been using here is, for those of you who play a game called Set, you may have played it in different platforms, and you may find that if you play it for hundreds and hundreds of hours, you become very attuned to very particular of a particular arrangement, right? If the color is slightly different, you will suddenly see a cost, right? Like if you use a new app or something like that. So there may well be some caching of certain operations that are afforded if you consistently use a particular format of representations to perform a particular task. But I don't think this necessarily tells you that that format is like a core part of how you reason about exclusions, which is what the game of set, or unities or something like that. So I think there's very interesting effects of format on speeded performance, but I don't think it bears on the question of whether the underlying representations are realistic. But happy to talk. Tom?
I'm curious if you think that language models do not have language and thought robustly distinct in their encodings. And if you do, how can you believe that? If you don't, then how can we use them to study language and thought in the brain?
It's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of Anya will talk a lot more about it. A lot of the early language models are really not that great at reasoning, right? They're very fragile. A lot of the later models are pretty impressive, and a lot of us have been impressed by how good they are. So then it becomes an empirical question, right? To the extent that a model shows some good performance on language and math, can we see some...
You did just show us a result showing that the more recent models actually predict brain activity more accurately. The GPT-4 model was better than...
No. So let me just finish that. So you can ask whether there is a separation in the internal representations of the model when they're solving math tasks, math problems versus language, right? So I know a few groups are working on trying to tease these things apart, asking exactly the same kinds of questions, like to the extent that a model is now like a multitasker, do we see separation in how these different tasks are represented? Is there some emergent modularity, even if it wasn't built in, right? Or you can ask a question like, if I build a model where I explicitly add these constraints, does it do better than a model where you kind of wait for it to naturally emerge or something like that? So I think there's just a lot of work to do in that space yet, similar to how we've done with neural data.
Yeah, connected to this was also my question, like concerning for example, the O1 and R1 models. That, they have been showing that given the possibility to the model to recursively produce strings of speech, actually they become better and better in reasoning. And so how this could reconcile with your findings that actually in the brain language and thoughts are...
You mean like the chain of thought kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well that's the effects that I'm talking about, where you can use linguistic representations to help offload some things out of your working memory. At least in humans, thinking about working memory in models is different, right? But we use all sorts of tools to help us think, right? Do you draw charts, do you draw diagrams, do you draw tables, Venn diagrams, or whatever, right? To help you understand certain concepts and how. So we're very creative. So we have tools at our disposal, including language. But one thing to highlight maybe is that, and Shaylee also made this point, the context of integration of the language processing mechanisms is really short. It's up to about 8 to 10 words, okay? So, because we're memory limited. So we get linguistic input, we crunch it, get the meaning out, and discard the form. And there's a lot of behavioral evidence from the 70s showing we have very poor memory for exact wordings, right? We get the meaning out because that's the goal, right? So to the extent that you start thinking about these kind of chain of thought effects, those are at much, much longer temporal scales. So that already tells you that it cannot be the case that you're using that language system, which is very short windows, to do this. So presumably you just take some abstract representation, you convert it into a format that's now more tangible. You can write it out, you can draw it out, or whatever. And then using this all in your whatever workspace at your disposal, you can do better than you would just kind of doing it all with internal crunching alone.
So you think R1, it's a plausible model of how human cognition reason, how reasoning is?
I think there's many, many steps before you can say that. I think there's many, many tests to do using good experimental psychology tools, as Anya will also emphasize.
I just had a question purely to do with human processing, so nothing to do with models. You said at the beginning that there's speech perception and production areas, and that those are activated even if you're hearing a language that you don't understand, but not if I hear a dog barking or something.
That's right.
What I don't fully get about that is how. So how that distinction can even happen if let's say I'm listening to Morse code or something, just a bunch of beeps. If I know Morse code, then I'm guessing like those language areas are going to activate. But if I don't, it's
but
not
not speech areas. Language areas, but not speech areas, because speech areas are not getting the spectrotemporal features to which they appear to be attuned.
So those areas are specific to the specific modality of like
That's
humans.
right.
Okay.
Spoken language. Yes.
Human language.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, great. I think we're running to lunch, so
Yes.
let's thank Ev for.
Thank you very much.
We'll be back here at 2 for Anya's talk.